Yeah, it's as usual taking a second to load, but
yeah, it takes a few minutes sometimes. It's okay.
Checking on restream that it's actually showing up. Okay, I think we are good to go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Sage, for getting us started. Thank you everyone for joining us for another book club. This month we'll be featuring Stone Blind with author Natalie Haynes, hosted by myself, Cassandra May. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin, as usual. A little bit about what SASA is with the Save Ancient Studies Alliance. Our mission is to reverse the current downward trend in the study of the ancient world by engaging the public and bringing together students and scholars to share their passion for the study of the ancient world in order to inspire a vast new generation of students. You can find us on all of the major social media platforms by just searching Save Ancient Studies. We do have a somewhat new TikTok. Definitely check us out there. We're trying to put up new, interesting content. Our live event protocol, we just ask that you please be kind and respectful. Listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the event. As we go, please put them in the chat box and we'll read them off. Please be patient with technology and those administering it. Our live events are live streamed on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. They are also recorded and archived, and recordings will be posted on the above platforms shortly after the event. And lastly, just have fun. If you like our events, please consider supporting SASA by becoming a recurring donor. Things like our Archeo Gaming, book clubs, reading groups. We'd love to see the support come in, and for as little as $3 a month, you can help us save ancient studies, and that's saveancientstudies.org/donate to learn more. And lastly, again, thank you for joining us. I'm going to stop my screen share now. And yes, this month we're featuring Natalie Haynes with her just released in the US novel, Stone Blind. Natalie is a writer, broadcaster, classicist, and comedian. She's previously written books such as Pandora's Jar and 1,000 Ships, just to name a couple of her previous works. And she's also host of the BBC radio broadcast, Natalie Haynes Stands Up for the Classics. It's an honor to have her with us today. Natalie, how are you? Is there anything that I missed that you'd like to say about yourself to get us started?
No, it always sounds to me like you're talking about somebody else, to be honest. I get introduced to quite a lot of places, and generally I'm like, oh, that sounds cool. Oh, that sounds cool. And I feel completely detached from it. As soon as I really like making things, but as soon as I finish making it, it's like, it's a whole separate other thing. I bet, you know what my favorite making of a thing is? It's probably to cook something, because then you can eat the results, you know? When I knit something, I give it away the second I've finished it. I'm like, I don't want it now, I've made it now. So yeah, no, it always feels to me like it's like, oh, cool, someone else is, oh no, me, right, yes, no, got it, okay, here I am, ask me a question. And essentially I'm doing that inside my head the entire time anyone introduces me on anything.
I get that the adventure is in the making. For sure. All right, so to get us started a bit, and definitely anyone watching, feel free to put those comments in the chat. We'll read them out as we go as well. But I guess my first question is a bit of an intro to Stone Blind. For those watching who might not be familiar, it is a retelling of the Medusa myth. I do have the book here. Hopefully it will show.
I've got mine somewhere.
There we go.
Yeah. I do have a hard copy now because they came last week, but somehow I'm still using the proof copy, the ARC that they sent me. So yeah, I have mine too.
Nice. It is a beautiful cover. I find it very pretty.
It's cool, isn't it?
It's so cool. But I was wondering, why did you choose this myth in particular? What drew you to it, and how does your retelling differ from traditional mythology and what people might be familiar with?
Well, I wrote a chapter on her in Pandora's Jar, which has 10 chapters on 10 different women in Greek myth, or 9 women, 1 Gorgon. And at the end of that chapter, which I guess is probably about 9,000 words long, I was just still really angry about everything that happened to her. both within her myth and then sort of to her myth subsequently, because for sure it's the case that our ancient sources are much more sympathetic by and large to Medusa than more modern iterations. And obviously I'm using modern in the sense of classicists using it, by which I mean anything that's happened in the last 600 years. And so I just felt really kind of, I don't know, I was kind of outraged for her. It's like, how dare we treat her this way? How dare all these awful things happen to her? How dare she be sexually assaulted by one god and then monstered literally and metaphorically by another? How dare she be attacked by some puny, stupid mortal? How dare? I was so cross. And I kind of thought, well, if you've written all those words, a whole, extended essay on somebody, and you still feel this raw on their behalf, you probably owe them a book. That's probably if 9,000 words isn't enough, then what's the next thing? A novel, for sure. So I went back to the beginning and looked at the sources that I'd examined in Pandora's Jar. And this time, instead of coming in with quite a sort of outsider's, quite kind of critical, not critical, but just critical lens, I thought I would imagine her from the inside and do things that way. And very quickly, of course, it became clear that although it's a much smaller set of people than in Ships, because Ships is the entire Trojan War. It's got all those Greek women, all those Trojan women, all those goddesses, all those mortals, the odd Amazon thrown into the extra bit. This has a smaller cast, but equally it has that thing that Ships has, where there are loads of female characters involved in this one story, from the closest kind of relations. So Medusa isn't, as we so entirely tend to see her now, a sort of solitary monster who lives in a cave. She's one of three sisters. The other two Gorgons are devoted to her. They're both immortal. She's mortal. That means surely, I decided as I started out, they'll have this very protective relationship towards her, because they can't die. They can't even get hurt. And then suddenly they have a sister who's incredibly fragile by the standards of a divine being. So yeah, I thought if you can feel so much righteous anger on someone else's behalf, then there must be a way of telling that story so that other people feel that way. And so very quickly it became a book about heroes and monsters and how we define those two categories, because my belief was that we were looking at this story the wrong way around.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And the fragility of Medusa, especially towards the beginning of the book, is something that really spoke to me. And that kind of leads into my next question. And I apologize if I go a little long. I know brevity is not my strong suit by any means. But the back of the book, it reads, they will fear you and flee you and call you a monster. And early in the book, we open with a brief discussion of what makes a monster. And you note that the hero is often monstrous themselves. It reads, and the monster, who is she? She is what happens when someone cannot be saved. Can you expand on this idea that the monster is sometimes, a victim of abuse and assault, someone who's responding to pain and trauma and tribulation that's often the result of the actions of, say, a hero, in quotes?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting thing in Medusa's story, because even by the standards of ancient myth, she gets a really raw deal. So in the first instance, with almost no exceptions, I think Pindar has her having a consensual sexual relationship with Poseidon, but in almost every other source we have, Medusa is raped or sexually assaulted by Poseidon. And in almost all versions of that story, it happens in a temple of Athene. And in most versions of the story, Athene punishes not Poseidon, who you would hope see as the perpetrator of this both abuse and also blasphemy, as Athene perceives it, but she doesn't punish Poseidon, she punishes Medusa. It's the earliest instance I can think of in literature of a survivor of rape being monstered in its most literal meaning. She's not just spoken of in an unkind way, but she is literally made a monster. It is at this point that she gets the snakes for hair that we associate so intimately with Gorgons. We sort of assume that they always have snakes for hair, but at least in Medusa's case, certainly in the version of the story that we get, for example, in Ovid's Metamorphoses, that's not true. We're told in Ovid's version that she is a very beautiful young woman, that suitors flock from across the Greek world in order to try and claim her hand in marriage. And then after this assault at the hands of Poseidon and the monstering at the hands of Athene, only then does she lose her hair, which is her most beautiful feature, Ovid's narrator in this part of the Metamorphoses tells us, and it's replaced with snakes. And it's like, well, how many times is this one character going to be punished for other people's actions? And it seemed to me that, you know, in this narrative, Poseidon was the sort of simplest monster. He was, as is so often the way with these super powerful gods in this patriarchal society of Bronze Age myth, he sees something that he wants and he grabs it. But then she has a more nuanced relationship with Athene. But Athene's response is no less toxic, no less cruel, no less of an abuse of power, really, than Poseidon's. And because of her mortal status, which is something that's kind of tossed into our laps by Hesiod in the Theogony, and he says, oh yeah, there are 3 Gorgons, Stheno, Euryale, Medusa, and the first 2 are immortal and the last one is mortal, and that's a wretched fate. Move straight on. You're like, dude, do you have any more to say on this? Because it feels like it could be quite a, no, okay, right, moving on. And so when I started out writing the book, I was absolutely sure that the kind of central tension between these 3 Gorgons, these 3 sisters, would be essentially that one will die and 2 won't. And then almost immediately, like 20 minutes after I'd started it, it became clear that actually the thing that was more important wasn't mortality, but was what comes along with mortality, namely fragility. That if you are a superpower immortal Gorgon, you know, what's the worst thing that's going to ever happen to you on a day-to-day basis? Nothing. You're already more powerful than everyone you face all the time. Are they as powerful as an Olympian god? Maybe not, but they don't live on Olympus, so it doesn't matter. They're these liminal creatures. They are daughters of sea gods, so they live by the sea, but they don't live in the sea. They live on land, but they've got wings, so they can fly. So they have this kind of not quite as lofty as Olympus level of divinity, but they have power and strength in a way that mortal creatures can't ever even strive for, you know? And so the first kind of question I had to ask was, what does it mean to be immortal? And the answer is you never change, because you'll never die. So, you know, any changes to your character are going to be so minuscule over so long that they'll be literally impossible for us to register with our tiny, puny mortal lives. And so what could change that? And it seemed to me that getting this mortal sister was, it's like, well, what happens to unchanging creatures when they're suddenly given someone who changes every day to love? What happens then? Yeah. And the answer was that of course you change, because what you love changes. And so that seemed really quickly to be the kind of emphasis behind it. And at least part of that was caused by the fact that this novel was written when the UK, where I live, was locked down. So I was writing this book at the same time that my nieces were growing up, from being teeny at the start of it to being marginally less small by the end of it. And it was that thing where you would look at them over a video call and you'd be like, did you grow like a foot since last week? Did you even tell anyone you were going to do that? Did you ask if it was okay? And that sense that, you know, this tiny creature is changing in a way you don't see it happening, and yet, there it is. That is all me, I'm afraid. So as these Gorgons are like, how did that happen? It's like, yeah, that's my bafflement straight the way through.
I can relate to that. As an aside, I have 2 kids myself, and it
is sinister the way they sneakily pretend to be the same, and they go to bed one night and then they get up and you're like, you did not have that extra inch of height yesterday. What exactly has happened here? How did you do that? Which room are you sleeping in?
Exactly. So, I mean, the book, it takes place from a perspective of, you know, multiple characters, in particular, you know, gods like Hera, Poseidon, Athena, to name a few. Why did you choose to bring the story of Medusa to life, in part, you know, through the stories of other gods and beings in Greek mythology?
I love a polyphonic novel. I love the sense that I think there's a tendency with women's stories for us to believe they should be told in a small way. They're small domestic stories of a small domestic person with no influence outside. No, they aren't. They're human beings, and they have, or Gorgons in this particular instance, and they have consequences in and around the world that they're in and around. Of course they do. We all do. It's just a sort of weird prejudice that says that men's experience is universal and women's happens in this tiny box of it. No, it doesn't. Shove up, men. There is room for everyone. And so I really wanted it to be clear that for Medusa to have the life and death that she has, the narrative arc that I give her, and that many people have given her a variation on before me, that she's not in isolation, you know, and that all these different characters, from, you know, the instantly antagonistic, like Athene is to her when they are first brought to one another's attention, to the incredibly devoted and loving relationship she has with her sisters, mutually so, and very nurturing, that there would be this sense of a female life that's not held in a small kind of cluster of people, but that has ramifications across multiple places and multiple families. And, you know, Medusa's life and death causes all kinds of consequences for all kinds of people who never even meet her because of the way these things happen. And equally, there are female characters whose impact on her life, Danae, the mother of Perseus, you know, she'll never meet this character. And yet, you know, this young woman who is, you know, traumatized essentially by being treated abysmally by her father, locked up, caged up, you know, so she can't get pregnant and have a child who will overthrow him, etc., etc. All the fear, that fear you see in the patriarchal society of Greek myth over and over again, that men are terrified that their sons will grow up to overthrow them in some way, or grandson in this case. And it's like, well, these lives have huge reaching consequences, and we're so used to minimizing the consequences of women's lives and kind of accepting that that's just normal. It's not normal. Just because we do it doesn't make it normal. It just makes it widespread. And I refute that it's necessary or appropriate. So yeah, I was really keen to sort of say, well, okay, well, what happens? What happens if we treat this female character's life in the same way that we've historically treated heroic male lives? Because often, particularly in Greek myth, these heroes aren't heroes like they are somebody virtuous whose behavior you'd aspire to replicate. They're just the person at the center of a story. And, you know, why would I make Perseus the center of a story about Medusa? Gorgons and Gorgon heads existed in Greek art long before any mention of Perseus. It is vastly more likely that Perseus was invented in order to give a reason for why we see so many Gorgon heads, Gorgonea, to give them their Greek name, all over the Greek world, separate from Gorgon bodies. So we need, it's like, well, how come there's a head without a body? Well, I guess if some guy had a sword, that might explain it. Whereas I think we tend to see it as, you know, this is a hero overcoming a monster narrative. Well, no, it isn't. Stop centering men's experience at the, you know, expense of everybody else. And you can soon see that there's a lot more to do with this story. There's certainly a lot of different things to tell in this story if you prioritize her rather than him.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's striking to me in this novel when I was reading it, kind of looping into this, is just how cold and selfishly motivated the gods in general are.
Yeah. It's hard to care, isn't it? If you're going to live forever, it is really difficult to care. And I mean, they're obviously my versions of the gods, but they owe a great deal to the way those gods are depicted in Homer, particularly in the Iliad, and later in the work of Euripides, you know, like the Hippolytus, when Aphrodite is so poisonous, you know, she's so toxic to everyone around her. But, you know, the versions that we see of Hera and Athene in the Iliad, I suppose specifically, they're so aggressive, they're so determined to cause maximum destruction at any time when they feel that the Greeks are under threat. their behavior is incredibly aggressive. And it's like, well, why would we expect better of them, really? Because they're gods? Well, whose idea of a deity is that? Ancient deities generally are quite obnoxious because they're often standing in for the natural world or parts of the natural world that are incredibly destructive. Do you look on Poseidon kindly? If you're an ancient Greek, maybe. If you're a seafaring person who makes it home safe every time, probably not if you live somewhere which is stricken with earthquakes, which is a lot of ancient Greece and or Italy. So I think if you can't understand that there are tectonic plates moving against one another, and how on earth could you possibly understand that with ancient science being available to you, but not more than that, then you'd need an explanation for why the natural world is so incredibly cruel. And these gods are often standing in for that. When they're mocking philosophy in Aristophanes' Clouds, one of the ways that he does it is to say to the character of Socrates in the play says to the old man whose name is Strepsiades, I'm going to say, I think, and he says, so Zeus punishes perjurers, right? And how does he do that? Big bolt of lightning. And he says, right, and so what happens when a bolt of lightning hits an oak tree? Has that committed perjury or what? And it's like, Strepsiades is kind of going, no, I don't think so. They don't normally do. He says, well, what happens when a bolt of lightning hits a temple of Zeus? Has the temple of Zeus displeased him? And you realize that these questions feel really modern to us, but they're not at all. The questions are as old as the gods. Xenophanes was cheerily saying 2,500 years ago that if dogs and horses had hands and could draw, their gods would look like dogs and horses. He knew that the Greeks had made their gods in their own image. So of course they're going to be as, petulant as human beings. But the thing is, they've got this incredible power. So they're basically like toddlers. They're pure id, but with superpowers. They've got no conscience, because why would they have, right? And in their interactions with human beings, they can't possibly hope to understand. Our lives are so short to them, living as they do forever. It would be like me asking you to really try and understand the motivations and life conditions of an ant or a mayfly, something that's going to die after 24 hours. You'd be like, well, I don't know. It's only got a day. And I wouldn't think of you as being heartless if you felt that way. You couldn't move through your life, with a gigantic bleeding heart for every single tiny bug that you might inadvertently tread on as you go about your day. And yet that's sort of because we've centered ourselves, of course, in a narrative, it's like, well, why are these gods so cruel? It's like, because we're the ant in this story. From their perspective, we're the bug. And not only can they not understand us, but of course we can't understand them. Because if I were to be able to ask an ant, which I would struggle with because I'm a little afraid of bugs in truth, although not so much ants because they're small, but if they were big, I wouldn't like it at all. And they are bigger in some parts of the world, so let's discuss it no further. But if I were to be able to communicate with an ant and say, what's Cassandra's motivation? How would the ant know? Yeah. It's going to be dead in 20 minutes. It hasn't got time for you. So it felt like there was this central, complete incapacity to communicate with one another that would be either really frustrating or tremendous fun to exploit. And it turned out tremendous fun was the answer.
Yeah, I mean, even Medusa in the book questions why anyone would worship a god like this in quotation marks, speaking of Poseidon. And you answered a bit of this. Why do you think the stories of things like Greek mythology, and in this case the story of Medusa, held such power in the ancient world and have remained a mainstay of culture and storytelling into the present day?
My feeling is that it's because human experience and the human life is so centered in these narratives that, relative to, for example, Norse myth, where there's a really big snake or everything's happening on a really big tree or whatever, it's a very human centric experience. Even the gods, who are gods, behave like people, or like people might if they had no conscience and no consequences. And so they're greedy and they're petulant and they're jealous or envious, both. All our worst instincts basically are embodied by these gods and goddesses. And so I think there is something really archetypal in Greek myth that it kind of illustrates myth is a mirror, right? So it reflects back the time in which you observe it just as efficiently as the time in which it was made, has these multiple timelines kind of lurking within it. And so when we look at Greek myth, what we see is obviously from a 21st century perspective, and we're looking at the ancient world with that perspective. We can't shed it. We can just be aware of it. And obviously when people were engaging with Greek myth during the Renaissance for artists or whatever, then their time is reflected in that too, and that's not even necessarily in a moral way. You only have to look at the way in which, for example, Helen of Sparta, Helen of Troy, is depicted through the ages, to see that at the most irrelevant really to our moral understanding of her. Just look at the way she looks differently. She reflects the ideals of beauty from every age where she's created. And so now people look at ancient versions of her and they're like, really? That's what the most beautiful woman in the world is supposed to look like. But when we look at what the pre-Raphaelite version, and she sort of looks, to my eyes, quite insipid, it's like, well, is that more beautiful or less? So it's obviously the ideal of beauty of its own time. So, I think we're probably doing that with ethical questions the same way we're doing it in terms of, artistic or aesthetic references. And so I think somehow through the whole of the time that it's existed, Greek myth has always had a centering of human emotion, which means that even when the circumstances of a society change, so for example, when I'm reading a Greek tragedy in 21st century London, I live in a world that my bit of the world doesn't have slavery in it. Although, of course, as I always feel obliged to say, there are more slaves in the world now than there were at any point in ancient society, not least because there are more people, but just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I can move through the world without thinking, slavery, this is just a normal part of life. I can see it as something as reprehensible as it is, but I can still find my life, my world, a world I understand in a myth which is created in a world which was predicated on slavery. And those things don't cancel each other out or create distance between us. They just mean that I have to stop and think for a moment before I start absorbing the myth and what it might mean.
Yeah. So I've just got one more question, and then I think I'll read off some that are starting to come into the chat just to give time to get all of those in. Definitely drop them in as we're going. Reading the book, I started to feel bad almost even for Perseus because the poor guy, he doesn't seem to be the brightest, and he's trying as best he can, I think, to complete the quest that's given to him. But the gods continually are like, you're not trying hard enough, try harder, without actually being entirely helpful themselves. It almost looked like a toxic relationship in some ways to me. Would you be able to speak to this in terms of the relationship between the gods of Greek myth and humanity? Are there any redeeming qualities to these gods?
Not a lot. No, not a lot from our perspective, I don't think. I mean, I'm glad you see him that way, because I feel that way about him, that he's so hopeless that you're kind of impatient with him, and yet at the same time it's like, well, he can't help it, I suppose. And so I don't kind of completely blame him, but I know, for some people they read it and they're like, God, he's just an idiot. And it's like, well, he is an idiot, but essentially he's an idiot because we almost always see him in conjunction with a deity, and they obviously understand each other so not at all. They're going to make absolutely no effort to understand him, because why bother, and he can't hope to understand them because they're on a different plane of existence. So they're constantly talking at cross purposes. Because he's so young, and again, this is one of those things where I think we kind of forget, because teenagers are like invented by Salinger. We sort of forget that there were nonetheless people of teenage age before that. And it's like, there's no guarantee you're going to be fully and, wholly mature at the time when you get sent out on a quest in Greek myth. You might be, as he is, afraid and kind of bratty and petulant. And it really all stems from my response or my feelings, I suppose, about a vase painting that's in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which shows the scene where Perseus is in the process of killing Medusa, and he's being helped by so many gods and goddesses. So he's wearing winged shoes. Those, of course, belong to Hermes. They've been borrowed, and they mean he can fly away from the scene of the crime. He's wearing a special hat that it does look like Hermes' hat, but it's almost certainly, at least if we include our literary sources to give us the full picture, the cap of darkness, which belongs to Hades. It makes the wearer invisible. He's holding a curved sword. It's called a harpe. It looks like a scythe. That belongs to Zeus. It's again alone. Zeus, of course, Perseus' father. And he's looking behind him at Athene, who's offering him advice. And he's doing all of this in order to kill a version of Medusa, which on this vase is from the 5th century BCE. She doesn't have snakes for hair. This is a version of Medusa which isn't a monster. She's just a young woman. And not only is she a young woman with beautiful black ringlets rather than snakes, not that I have anything against snakes, but anyway, she's a young woman asleep. You know, there's just 2 little tiny semicircles to show her closed eyelids. Mm-hmm. And so what you see when you look at this vase painting is this incredibly ambivalent response, not just mine to Perseus, but I think also the vase painters to Perseus, because you look at it and it's like, well, this son of Zeus, this demigod, is getting assistance from Hermes, Hades, Zeus, Athene, at the very least. In some versions of this scene and the scene after it, he's also got a cabesis, a sort of backpack for magical objects, for example, the head of a gorgon, and that's a loan from the Hesperides. So, and it's like, well, how? There are 2 ways of interpreting this. The first is, how blessed is this young man who has all these deities crowding around him to help him out. The second is, just how useless is he? Mm-hmm. That all these gods have to come and help him to do a thing. And as a novelist, of course, it's like, well, I want both of those things. I want him to never feel like he's blessed, because to him it's just like, well, this is impossible, I need help from another god. This is still impossible, I need help from another god, because that's how you would feel at 15 or 16, I think. He's only ever minutes away from going, I didn't ask to be born, and storming off. Exactly. Like, well, yes, that's how I would feel if somebody made me do an impossible task. Of course it is. And it's certainly how I'd have felt at 15. And emotionally, let us not pretend I'm any more mature than that now. I am not. But the other way of looking at it is, of course, the way that the gods perceive it, and particularly the way Athene perceives it, which is, how many of us do you need to help you? We're helping you all the time, and you're so useless. And so her impatience with him is fully warranted. And yet at the same time, it's really not his fault. So the version of him that you see in Stone Blind, I hope, is both pitiless and yet at the same time slightly sympathetic, because, you know, it isn't his fault. It is an impossible task. But he also goes about it with incredible bad grace. And while I'm sympathetic to the fact that, as I say, I would be the same in his position, you can see why when Hermes points out that technically Perseus and Athene are siblings, she's like, no, I don't think so. It's like, yeah, we kind of both got Zeus. In fact, all of us have got Zeus as a father. She's like, yeah, no, we're not having that conversation. She's not prepared to acknowledge that there's any kind of relationship, you know, familial relationship with them, even though they both claim Zeus as a father.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I felt simultaneously very annoyed and also super sympathetic to the character.
That was the plan. You've fallen into my trap. I'm delighted.
All right, so some questions have come in, and I apologize beforehand if I butcher anyone's name. Promise I'm not trying to. I blame being from New England. But
good early defense. Well done.
Yeah. Harula Samara says that they love the book. My question is, what made you make the decision not to mention Medusa's children?
Oh, it was a step too far, I decided. I looked really hard at it because I had a course written about Pegasus and Chrysaor in Pandora's Jar. And I felt that I was asking a sort of non-classics readership to take a lot on board. It's like, you know, that monster, she's not a monster. You know, that hero, he's not a hero. You know, that creature that lives alone, she's got sisters. You know this. Yeah. And so I felt like I was constantly trying to ask people to take what they knew and then extend it or flex it slightly. And it just felt a step too far to say, oh yeah, and also after she's been raped by Poseidon, she gets pregnant, but she doesn't give birth to those children in any kind of traditional way. They are produced through her severed neck at the point of killing, but then they just disappear from the narrative. You know, they're not sort of left on there's no bit of the story, at least none that I've found in literary sources or artistic ones, where she is killed and then they're sort of striding around on the beach. You know, is he a giant straight away? Is he a baby giant? He's fitted inside her body, so presumably he's tiny. Is it a tiny winged foal? It just felt like it's one of those things that seems great in a poem where you can just allude to something, but in a novel where you have to have the actual kind of physicality of it, it just felt like I was asking people to follow me slightly further down a path that didn't really take me anywhere, because it's like, well, she doesn't get to be what I would consider a mother, because she doesn't get to do anything maternal. She gets to be a kind of biological mother, but even that is so strange because, you know, it's at the moment of her death and via her neck. It just felt like I was asking readers to make a sort of suspension of disbelief. I didn't gain anything in the narrative from it. It felt to me like there was already plenty of pathos. I didn't need you to go, oh, that poor children, on top of all of that. There was plenty of sadness in it. So I felt it was a loss without a gain. And always with this kind of book, you have to make those choices over and over again. It's certainly not my most regretted choice with any book. The one I wish I'd been able to make work most and couldn't was in Ships. And it was that I was so sure I would be able to include Hermione, the daughter of Helen, in that. And every time I tried, it just took the narrative, I don't know, it kind of wobbled off balance. It was too far in the future somehow, even though, you know, she's contemporary, but I just couldn't find a way. I couldn't find a way where I could make this daughter miss her mother in a way which added to the sort of emotions of the book. And I couldn't find a way of centering her and making her emotions something more than that without taking the book off center. Sometimes you just have to accept there's not space for it. Another book, I suppose. Another book, another time.
There you go. Another book. And Jessica K. Anderson asks, will there be a North American book tour for you in the near future? Oh,
I hope so. Not with this book, I don't think, because you have to persuade people essentially that there's enough of an audience live in a country you don't live in for it to be worth them paying your airfare, essentially. And my US publishers at the moment, I think, feel really happy that I'm doing online events, but I don't know. It's quite complicated booking to do a live tour in America. You know, here, I was a stand-up comedian for a long time before I became a writer, so I already had loads of contacts with venues and stuff. And occasionally I sort of look into doing it in America, and, you know, almost immediately you hit you need a speaker's agency, you need to be represented. I just, oh God, I'm not the energy, I'm too busy. I owe another book in 20 minutes. I don't have time. So yeah, if there were less admin, sorry, I'm afraid to say it is always admin that defeats me for anything, because I have almost literally a zero tolerance attitude to it. And so generally, if the question is, will you come and do this gig? The answer is yes. If it's, and then fill in these 9 forms, no, already no. I can't even listen to you tell me what I have to do before I've lost interest in doing it, because I just can't. So yeah, when somebody makes it easy, yes, I will. But until then, no. But eventually, enough of you guys are going to be buying books that it'll become easier for someone else to do that on my behalf than to continue to deprive me of the chance to come and talk to you in real life. And then suddenly the scales will shift and it'll all be fine. I'm fully confident in this progression of stuff. So don't worry, it'll all be fine. Not yet, but soon, I hope.
Yes, certainly understand that. So if we want Natalie to come to the US, buy her book is what I'm hearing.
That is the rules. I am sorry. Yep.
And Karen Moore says that she appreciates your wonderful humor in general, and in particular with respect to Hera's unpleasant personality.
Oh.
Now Grace W says, love the book. I'm doing my classics A-level work at the moment. How did you decide which characters' perspectives you were going to write from?
Trial and error, usually. You can't always tell how much kind of juice someone will have. You know, I assumed when I started the Andromeda narrative, that it would be Cassiope, it would be her mother that I would have more interest in. And it just wasn't the case. There was such a, as I was drawing her my way, it felt like there was a real limit to her imagination because she's so self-absorbed. And I say that in a non-critical way. She's fully comprehensively self-absorbed, at least as I imagine her. But there just wasn't, that she just didn't have that kind of human curiosity, whereas Andromeda, who could easily have that same lack of interest in other people, has to have that interest precisely because her mother doesn't, and she has less power than her mother, so she's forced essentially to empathize, to think what it's like to be another person, not least her mother, on a kind of day-to-day basis as she navigates her way around her own life. So sometimes it's down to those kinds of pressures on a character's nature, or those kinds of circumstances, and sometimes it just goes that way. So the Perseus story is told almost entirely from the interactions he has with other characters as he goes along. And those are very episodic. So it's like, well, obviously he's going to have an encounter with the Graiai, and then he's going to have an encounter with the Hesperides, because, it's his bit of the story is a quest. He's got to accrue the objects and then do the thing and then do the thing. And so those kind of things, they sort of felt really integral straight away. But then sometimes there were things where the hardest thing by far was imposing a timeline of any sort, even one which is really vague and unspecified as it is in the book, on Athene, because it's so, not only can you not find a single timeline of events in the life of any god that of course you can't, because they don't acknowledge time, right? So it's going to be difficult straight away. But there are it's not just the case that if you look at two different artworks, they contradict each other, because that's routinely the case with characters in Greek myth. It's that sometimes they contradict each other within one artwork. And you're like, oh my God, are you serious? It's like, she's wearing what in the Gigantomachy as she goes into battle alongside the Who? Are you sure? Because I'm pretty confident they can't both be there and be decorating her out. So that bit was a tremendous challenge, the imposing any kind of timeline on her, so that there would be some sort of sense of narrative resolution for a character that doesn't really acknowledge time. It's like, well, I'll give it my best shot. And eventually I kind of thought, well, these are the incidents I want to include, and I need to put them in an order which will give them a sense of dramatic momentum, which means essentially they'll get bigger and then retreat and then retreat, and there'll be a sense that it's building. But it was incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I believe that. I think it would be very challenging to create this narrative when retelling myth that's often told in a very episodic fashion. And Helen Baird asks, which goddess would you most identify with?
Well, essentially none of them, because I have a conscience. And so, yeah, and since they just don't, I genuinely can't imagine what it's like to not care about anybody else. So, yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, no one wants me to say it, because the version of her in Stone Blind obviously isn't a good person at all. But of course, it's Athene while I'm writing her. It's always whoever I'm writing, I'm on their side while I'm writing them, because if I'm not, how will you know, I can't just write them villainous. So even in the moment when I'm writing Hera being appalling, I'm like, well, yeah, but from her perspective, this is completely rational and reasonable behavior. You know, she's got these different pressures on her, and that's why she's behaving in this particular way. So yeah, I still do love Athene, even though she's not an exemplary person in this novel. I do still love her, but yeah, no, I'm not sure I'm like any of them. I've got slightly too much ethical awareness, I think.
That's certainly fair, definitely. Sarah Williams says, hi, Natalie. Thanks to you, I'm now doing a 6-year part-time humanities degree, and I'll graduate when I'm 62. Congratulations.
Come on, that is great.
She writes that it's a long story. Anywho, love your work and how you bring the classics to life. I'll be at German Street, and I'm sorry if I butchered that, theater.
No, that's fully correct.
Fortnight. Can't wait to see you live. What's next for
Well, what's next for me is that I would ideally have finished the next book before German Street, and of course, because I live in the actual world, I will not have finished it. So what I'll be doing is writing until like 4 minutes before I need to leave the house, and then running all the way to German Street, and then turning up, going, "Hi everyone, hi!" Because I mean, I wish I were more organised, but with the available parameters, this is where we are. But yes, that was a fundraiser that I wanted to do for German Street. So. Although I've done a few shows for them over the years, I've been a prize in their charity auctions a couple of times, and this year, I don't know, we just thought it might be more fun if I gave them a show, so they get to keep the box office. And honestly, I was going to do quite a bit of boasting about how incredibly altruistic I was, and then the show sold out in about a day or something. So we were planning to go like, oh, here are tickets for this, and then like the next time we share it, it'd be like, here are tickets for this, and I'm not even taking a fee, I'm doing this just to raise money, please buy your ticket. And it was all sold out. So I was like, oh my god, I didn't even get to walk around being incredibly sanctimonious. This is an outrage. I'm appalled. This is my first chance to say, and I'm not even getting paid, I'm just doing it as a gift to theatre. You're welcome, the world of performance. So yeah, no, I promise, I promise is probably overstating. I will do my absolute utmost to be on top of ancient theatre and how it evolved by the time of that show. But I do also have another book to finish between now and about 3 days after that. So I don't guarantee how sane I'll be by then. But then that's the promise that you should never make, because you can't keep it. But next up is the sequel to Pandora's Jar. So the UK will get that this autumn. And the US will get that next spring, I think. But I'm not allowed to tell you the title for a little bit longer, which is tiring because I have to keep remembering not to. So yeah, I'll be really, really glad when we're allowed to tell you the title of it.
Hey, wonderful. And Karen Moore says, very tricky that you wrote Medusa's first person narration as a severed head.
I mean, was it tricky? It was a delight to do, although it took me a while to get the voice right, because it appears earlier in the book, and it seemed completely fine the way I'd written it then. And then when I got a kind of longer go on it, rather than just these little kind of like episodic moments, I was like, oh no, that voice doesn't work at all now. Like, oh, and so it took me longer than I thought. I'd already got the voice, and then when I started to write the voice, I was like, it took me a few days to find it, and then I had to just go back and correct the earlier ones. Be like, oh no, it's all wrong now. And it was kind of, you can never see that this is what will happen. You know, the voice that I had worked really well for the thing that it was doing, but as soon as I asked any more of it, it just crumbled. And then the voice that I needed just took a little longer to find, and that's sometimes how it goes. So yeah, no, I'd always wanted to tell that chunk of the book from the head's perspective, because I felt like it would be, I don't know, it just felt like a very me thing to do. There are chapters narrated by a snooty olive tree, one by a chatterbox crow, so it's very much not a human-centric book. And I was like, well, whose voice do we never hear? And it felt to me so much a consequence of the fact that that she's literally silenced, that she doesn't ever get to speak about the experience of being monstered and killed because she's literally silenced. And it was like, well, again, I don't accept that. So now we'll do something different. And so yeah, I was worried when I got there the first time. It's about, sorry if you haven't read it yet, you can not listen for the next 3 minutes, and I promise I'll be done by 51. But the first time through, it felt to me like the most tremendous, like a handbrake turn, when I got to the point where the head starts narrating. And I was like, is anyone going to be okay with this? You know, the book is constantly shifting tone, it's constantly shifting voice and perspective. And then suddenly, like 4/5 of the way through, it's like, come over here, everyone. Bang! And she's just going to yell at you for ages. And it felt it just felt like such a massive ask. And then when I went back, having finished the section, I went back and edited that section, and then that was and so I went back to the start of the book, and the second time through, I could barely see the handbrake turn that felt so severe the first time through. And I guess it's just that thing where sometimes the act of making it feels much more dramatic than the thing that you've made. And so it became clear really, really quickly that something which looked like it was going to be quite disruptive to the narrative was actually not going to disrupt it at all. There you go. I finished Pool 51. Promised I would. Turn it back on.
Wonderful. And let's see, I think we've got time for at least a couple more. We've got one more here to read. Aga Arcis says, hi, Natalie and Cassandra. Thank you so much for this great talk. Natalie, do you plan to write about goddesses and heroines from other cultures, Mesopotamia, for example? Or do you find Greco-Roman literature worth exploring even more? Good notes. I just would love to hear your take on Mesopotamia goddesses, to be honest. And thank you and congratulations on yet another fantastic book.
Oh, thank you. No, I won't write about Mesopotamian goddesses, certainly not soon, because I just don't know enough about them. And I feel like you should know your thing, huh? I started doing Latin at 12 and ancient Greek at 14. So I've been in this world for a really long time now. And I have read an awful lot of it. I've read a lot of material, and I feel like you can not agree with me, but I did read it and think about it really hard for a really long time. And that seems to me the least you can do, essentially, if you're going to offer to reinterpret things for people. You've got to know why they were interpreted one way in the first place before you offer them something different. So yeah, no, the Greco-Romans are going to hold me for a while longer. As I say, the next book to come out will be Pandora 2, and that's goddesses in Greek myth, looked at with the same cheery anachronicity as they are in Pandora. So one minute I'll be telling you about the version that's in Hesiod, the next minute I'll be telling you about, a version that's in a song that happened a year ago, and then the next minute I'll be taking you back to a Renaissance painting. So jumping around time and media, art forms and so on, in order to kind of say, who are these characters and why do we think of them in these terms, and what were they once and why might that have shifted? So that should be fun. And then there's another novel after that, and then another non-fiction book after that. But yeah, then I might have a break. Not a long break, don't panic.
All right. And Sarah Williams asks, is there a particular book you wish you'd written?
Wow. I mean, loads of books. Doesn't everybody? When you read a really wonderful book, don't you think, oh, I wish I'd done that? In fact, sometimes I think the kind of measure of book, which is so kind of audacious, is when you can't even think, I wish I'd written that, because you're too busy thinking, how did you write that? It's like, what did you just do? There are books where I can kind of just imagine what it's like to have been briefly so brilliant that you could create it. And other times when you're like, yeah, nope, I don't even know where you started. I don't know where you started. I don't know how you did it. I feel like that almost every time I read Ali Smith for a start. It's like, what? How did anyone do that? How did you do that? But how did a human brain do that? So yeah, I can't remember the last time I read a book and thought, God damn it. Oh, I wish that was mine. Yeah, no, I don't know. But routinely, I mean, not currently particularly, because I'm mainly reading reference for Pandora 2. But yes, it happens to me all the time. I mean, I think it shouldn't it? Imagine if you were so delighted with yourself that you never felt the slightest prick of, wow, this person's done something properly astonishing. That would be a dispiriting time.
Yep. Might put you maybe in line with some of the Greek gods.
Yeah, always a very high risk.
So it's just a bit of a fun question I found online to wrap up. We don't seem to have too many more or any more left. If you could meet your characters, what would you say to them?
I mean, they're all so different. I don't know. I'm not sure who I'd get on with the best, actually. And that's always a bit of a challenge. I think I'm probably most like Uriali out of everybody in the book, probably. But sometimes it's hard to know, people always assumed with ships that I was Penelope because she's the first person and her voice isn't wildly off from mine. And my mom read it, of course, and said, oh, everyone's going to think you're Penelope and they'll never know you're Cassandra. I feel so seen, as the young people say. So, yeah, but even then you kind of think, well, is that the people you're closest to? That's not the same thing as who you'd want to meet. I mean, Danae is probably the nicest person to meet, I would think, in Stone Blind, because, you know, she'd probably just make you something nice to eat, and, you know, she'd sit you down at her table, and, you know, it'd be nice. She's got a lovely view of the sea. That sounds quite good. So yeah, I don't think that would be too bad as these things go. I mean, any of the deities, obviously terrible, terrible, terrible idea. So you'd have to shun all of those straight away. I don't, Andromeda's a bit fancy for me. I'm kind of more of a pizza kind of girl than a sort of royal palace kind of person. So yeah, I don't know. I think Danae is probably the most sort of manageable of the characters that are there. Medusa, I don't know, I worry too much about her. I think I just worry about her from even closer up then. And she's dealt with enough of my concerns up to this point. I think she should be allowed to just go and do her own thing.
Certainly fair. Looks like we've got 5 minutes left. I have one more question I haven't asked yet, so I'll do it now. Do you think this book would have been written, or a Medusa story, I'm sorry, would have been told differently in a matriarchal society versus a patriarchal one that we see in ancient Greece?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because we'll never really know what it's like to have a matriarchal society, because if any have ever existed, we've got pretty well no evidence to prove it. You know, we've made good goes at extrapolating that this or that society must have been matriarchal, but you've always got to be a bit suspicious of the must have been argument, because, you know, it's like, oh, I don't. So yeah, I mean, my feeling is that the myth of Medusa is heavily affected by an abiding male fear of the female gaze. And so all the way through writing it, I was thinking of that thing that Margaret Atwood said, where she said, men are afraid that women will laugh at them, and women are afraid that men will kill them. And of course, that is the issue for Perseus, essentially, all the way through the book. He's furious that people laugh at him, specifically, but not only women. But it's Athene's contempt that troubles him in a way that Hermes' contempt largely doesn't seem to in the same way. But really, it's about fear. It's like, well, how scared of women do you have to be before your response to them seeing you clearly is to decapitate them so they can't see at all? I'm thinking, of course, of that Cellini sculpture in Florence, where not only has Perseus killed Medusa, not only is he holding up her decapitated head in triumph, but he's trampling on her body as he does it. It's like, well, that, I mean, if you were looking for a really great metaphor for really rancid misogyny, that's pretty well it. You know, it's not enough to kill her. It's not enough to have silenced her. You have to still be expressing your fear and your loathing. And there's so much contempt in it, and it displays so much weakness, so much fear at its heart. And so I guess if the story of Medusa had been told in a matriarchal society, there would be much, much less emphasis on the fear of the female gaze. And there would be much more, perhaps, centering of the way the Gorgons are sisters to one another. You know, sisters aren't written about all that often in Greek myth. Yeah, we have a few, Antigone and Ismene in the Theban royal house, and obviously there are, because Priam and Hecabe have 50 sons and daughters, then they've got a reasonable number of grown-up female daughters by the time the war ends. But we don't get a huge quantity of narratives which really focus on sisters looking after sisters, although this must have been an incredibly common relationship in the ancient world because of high levels of maternal mortality. So I would imagine that in a more matriarchal society, there'd have been a much greater focus on those kinds of relationship. Although I suppose, who knows, in a matriarchal society, perhaps people would have worked harder to ensure that fewer women died in childbirth a little sooner.
Certainly fair, and I think that leaves us with a good point, gives people something to think about as they go about their day. I want to thank everyone for the great questions and conversation. Definitely don't get Stone Blind, as well as Natalie's other body of work. Natalie, any social media you want to plug, where people find you, maybe the preferred place for them to purchase your book?
Oh, you can purchase it from any good bookshop. I hope independent or Barnes and Noble should be all over it for you. The audiobook is available now on Audible in the US. That's me reading it. So if you don't like the way I sound, definitely just read it. If you do like the way I sound, maybe listen to it. And I am official Len Haynes on Twitter and Instagram, and Natalie Haynes stand-up classicist, which is, by the way, the name of my radio show / podcast for the BBC. Natalie Haynes stands up for the classics. So I'm Natalie Haynes stand-up classicist on Facebook.
Okay, thank you. And I think we'll end the stream here. Thank you again for joining us, everyone.